In this video, we're going to discuss how lab reports in this course will be written. The first part of the lab report is going to be the heading, and the heading will include your name, the title lab, the date the lab was performed, and if you worked with any lab partners, you should include their names as well. But please make sure your name is separate so I know who wrote the lab report. Then you're going to list the objective of the experiment. The objective of the experiment is actually given in the lab manual, so you simply have to copy it into the experiment. This is one thing that I expect to be the same for all students. You're then going to provide a list of equipment, so as you are performing the experiment, you should write down the equipment that you use. And you should be able to figure out what most of the lab equipment should be just from reading the lab manual. The next is the procedures section. For the procedures section, unless we deviate from the directions given in the lab manual, you'll simply type same as in the lab manual. If there are deviations, though, you should list them in the procedures section. The next part is the results section. This is where you will first reference the data that has been collected. You should indicate what actually was happening in the lab. And then you'll reference either a data table or a graph where the data is located. So you do not need to list out all the data in this section. It should either be in a table or a graph, usually a graph in this course. You then must explain what the results are. Usually we're trying to use the graph in order to get the slope and use the slope in order to find a value that we're looking for. And you must explain only numerically, so it was 5 meters per second, but you need to explain that that 5 meters per second is a velocity and the velocity of what it is, and where the results came from. So what equation do we use to go from the slope to the result value you just listed above? And typically with this, you will then do a percent error calculation to show whether or not the results were within the accepted value. You must then describe whether or not those results agree or disagree with the objective of the experiment, and that's going to go in the conclusion section. You must then provide evidence of that conclusion. So typically you're going to refer back to the percent error. If it's a low percent error, then you can say the objective was met. And if it's a higher percent error, you need to talk about why that might have happened. And so you can still trust the results, or the percent error was too high and you don't know why, and therefore you don't think the objective of the experiment was met. The report must be written in paragraph formats. You can't just list values. You need to discuss the values. And it must be in third-person passive voice, so there should be no personal pronouns. You would say the ball was dropped. You would not say I dropped the ball, or my group dropped the ball, or my friend dropped the ball. There should be no people actually in the lab. If there's a graph used to get the results of the lab, that graph must be included, and that graph must be properly labeled. And a labeled graph will include labeling the axes, including units, and giving it a title so you can refer back to it in your results section. You should now read over the rubric that's also attached in the labs folder to see how that rubric matches up with each part of the lab directions. And I want to also remind you that you are turning your lab reports in through SafeAssign. Lab reports must be in your own words. So you cannot turn in an identical lab report as your lab partner. You will have the same data, but the words that go around that presentation of the data need to be your own. So SafeAssign checks not only that of students in this particular course, but of past courses. So if you get a lab report from somebody that's taken another section or taken me in the past, that will register in SafeAssign. Now, SafeAssign is meant for English papers, where it's checking not only for identical work, but for missing citations. That means that no one's SafeAssign report is likely to be 0. I do look at the SafeAssign reports and realize, okay, it's just the objective that's the same and that's expected, but if I see large chunks of the report that are identical or nearly identical, like just a couple words changed, then you will both end up with a 0 on the assignment, which nobody wants. So please just do your own work. Remember that half of your credit is coming from your active participation in the data collection and analysis of that data. So a report with mistakes in it is going to automatically get you a higher score than one that is plagiarized because you are getting those points for active participation. So you don't want to lose those points by turning in a lab report that is plagiarized. Alright, so this is the sample lab report that is provided at the end of your lab manual, and I wanted to go through it and see how it matches up with the directions I provided. So you can see the first thing we have is the title of the lab, the person who wrote the lab, and then the name of the lab partners, the date that the lab experiment was performed. We then have the objective and the apparatus. I use the word equipment, but this is the equivalent thing. So you can see that the equipment used was just listed. I don't need pictures, I don't need descriptions. I'm just looking for the names of the equipment used. And then the procedure. So the procedure was not deviated from, so the procedure was the same as the given in the lab manual. In the results and analysis section, which I just call the results section, the person listed the equation that was used, explained what the variables were, and why they were using that particular equation. They then talked about some assumptions that were made and the final equation that is actually used. Then there is a graph with the axes labeled and the line of best fit displayed. The person then explains how the slope was then used in order to find the final results. And then in the conclusion section, the person discusses the percent difference and whether or not that percent difference supports or doesn't support the objective of the lab. And notice that this lab report is actually a little bit over a page long. Lab reports in this course should not be very long. So a page, page and a half is a very typical report.